Okay, so this is part 2 of the crisis acting and the orchestrated drama that these crisis actors are here to play out for our bamboozlement, preoccupation, the latest one being this tariff war. So yeah, just going to do a quick refresher of one of the key principles that was laid out in the first video, just to refresh your memory. If you haven't seen the first one, I highly recommend you go back because there's some critical groundwork in that one that's going to help bring this one to life and make it a lot clearer. So let's get started.
At the highest levels of all countries, they all belong to the same club. And we, the people, sit back and we watch this grand drama, which is being played out for our benefit, not theirs. If it wasn't for us, they wouldn't even have to do any of this. But you see, they just can't come out and destroy all of us because they need slaves. They need people to make their shoes and make their cars and mine the ore. They need worker bees, and that's what we are. In the New World Order, we will be the worker bees, the slaves. Most people are no better than animals who do not have intelligence because they don't use their intelligence. And to these men who control things behind the scenes, you are stakes on the table by choice and consent, and will always be ruled and manipulated and enslaved by people who do use their brains.
So this iteration is going to be about how those who call themselves freedom fighters or pro-freedom or whatever other title they like to add to themselves, spiritually evolved, etc., how they can be seduced and how easily it can happen to forego principle, even though they may have a history of being able to be solid in principle, how those cracks can still be exploited because they haven't really done enough work on themselves to be able to catch it, and how easily it can still happen if you're not aware of the inconsistencies, that you do hold certain beliefs that are out of alignment with principle. And if you're unwilling to face them because there's some kind of attachment there, then you will always be fooled on some level. And so I'm just going to show you a couple instances now where that's actually in play right now with certain people who would perceive themselves as being principled. So here we go. Okay, so this showed up during the process of me putting this video together. So yeah, it's, as they say, an offer too good to refuse. That's why I'm including it. Unexpectedly, but yet there's hopefully those who are here to learn can gain some value out of it. So this showed up in my feed, and yeah, it did surprise me on one level, but on another it didn't. Just because I'm starting to notice a pattern of regression in this particular individual. So this individual's made a name for themselves on creating content to do with the principles of natural law, especially the ones that are contained within the common law articles of Magna Carta 1215, and done really solid work on that, like absolutely, which I've been in awe of at times, actually, how clean and crisp it's been, right, and really well articulated. Yet sadly, when I saw this, I was like, wow, what can happen to people, like, my guess is there's some level of desperation and wanting and need for hope here, that things can improve. And yeah, even if it means compromising principle, they're willing to take it. So let me read the first one and then I'll read the second. And yeah, let's just see what there is to gain from this. Although taxes, including tariffs, are violations of natural law, okay, big deal right there, natural law, we'll get to that. I'm personally unable to stop Trump from imposing them. So right here, there's a suggestion of a powerlessness and a desperation for using whatever power structures there is. And, like if it means, I get what I want at the end, then I'm willing to go along with it. I can only express the arguments against them, but there is no arguments expressed. And the other thing is, if you're expressing truth, it's no longer an argument. However, like Topher, if this action by Trump results in the abolition of draconian laws about freedom and free speech, then I too hope that it succeeds. So there's some really critical information I'm going to get back into, but now I'm going to jump over to the other side. So this happened, this post happened a day later. But the evidence quite clear that Trump's tariffs are not all about economic readjustments, but are in fact a defense of the constitutional principles of free speech in some of America's closest allies. One wonders how long it will take dim-witted ideologues like Starmer and Elbow to realize that they are peeing into the wind. Now, before I go back to the first one, I just want to bring something up, right? There is no such thing as a written guarantee of free speech in a legitimate constitution. Because if you're going to now list out every single thing that's a natural right, it's not doable. You cannot do that. In a constitution, all that can really be done is set a standard of the behavior that makes sure that those who are delegated authority stay within that. That's all you can do. And so then the community knows when those people who take on those roles, they actually deviate from them, and then something can be done about it. But if there's no standard to measure from, and there's no awareness of the community of what that standard is, how can they do anything about it? That's essentially what a constitution is. So right there, what's written here is actually false. And you will actually, if you do watch this video that Topher Field does on that particular matter, he actually gets confused and says that same things, right? So that's not a principle that exists in nature, that you can start telling people what their rights are and you can guarantee them by writing them into a document. That's not what a constitution is. You know, a constitution is something that sets a free landscape for people to work out their own issues, and that they're going to be supported when those issues arise by the structure, right? And it's going to be done in a way that promotes restorative justice, where people's dignities, can be returned to the best that they can after the damage has been done, without there being like a sway of overly draconian or punitive measures for the perpetrator. Because if you keep punishing the perpetrator, you're just going to escalate more violence, right? So if you want an example of that, just look up the structure that they've got going in Rojava. I think it's northeast Syria, where the Kurds occupy that area. Right? They've actually got a whole restorative justice structure going before anything ever will get to a thing called a court. So really worth looking into, to seeing how that's going right now in this current climate. It exists. So the other thing about Topher's video is that it ended up being an expression of shameless self-promotion, where he promotes his documentary, his book, and his website on a couple of occasions. So tragically, that's what it ends up looking like, really. That these are just ways to get more people and eyeballs onto his material so he can, get some financial advantage from it. All right, now back to the first one, the first post. Now, in the consciousness of man, what's being expressed is that there are 7 transgressions of the laws of nature, one of which is coercion. Okay. Now, if you read this, there's a support for using coercion to actually get freedom. Now, if coercion is a transgression of the laws of nature, how is freedom ever going to be possible if you're going to transgress the laws of nature to win freedom? You can't do that. A transgression of laws of nature is in opposition to freedom, right? So that's a critical thing to understand, right? That's why I wanted to pin that, he's used natural law, and then everything he says after that goes in defiance of that. Now, when you get desperate, right, when you feel this oppression that seems like it's never going to end, one of the things that goes out the window is principle. Right? That's usually what happens. So my guess is that maybe there's something about that going on internally, where there's some kind of desperation, but I can't prove that. But they're just some suggestions of what could be going on as to how there can be a slipping away. Now, the real part of learning and growing is to catch yourself when you are giving into that seduction, and then actually, recognize it and then do something about it, right? That's the growth. And then seeing that you're not above it, no matter how cooked you think you are, that you're still susceptible to that it's an ongoing thing of catching yourself, right? That's, some people call that shadow work. When there's no one pointing that out, and if you're not spotting it, well, then how is that of service to you? Right? Now, the other thing that gets put here, sadly, is the whole political structure and supporting it, because what politics does is it splits people into different camps, it divides them, but really it's just an expression of the same ideology, but just in two different ways. And so what do people do when they support a political party? They actually support the policy measures that those particular flavor of slave masters want to impose on the entire population. So it doesn't matter that the rest of the population may not agree with it. It's not relevant. It's, well, they got the majority vote, so they get to do that, right? Now, if an individual at the individual level cannot just go and grab a bunch of people that they know and say, okay, you side with me, and that means we get to do what we want because we're the majority, and that makes it okay. If that doesn't exist at the individual level, how can it exist at the extrapolated level when we scale it up, right? Because if the government is there as a delegation of the authority that already exists with the individual, well, now we're gone into magical thinking, right? And so this individual that I'm talking about, they've actually done videos at length that explain that principle really well. And so that was the surprising part, is how they slipped from there. What the unsurprising part was that it was already part of a pattern of regression that I was noticing. And that's what happens. Once you deviate from principle and you don't spot it, you're going to keep doing it. And so that was the tragedy, I guess, here. So that's kind of what I wanted to express about, having the courage to spot when you are, dobbing yourself in, I guess, that you're being seduced, by the old, the end justifies the means. And when you look back in history, when has that ever really served peaceful cohesion, right? I haven't seen it happen. Just one more thing while I think of it. When have you seen one group of mid-level managers for their, overlords, as Bill Cooper explained, go against, and destroy another set of middle-level managers that isn't going to fit with what the overlord's plan is, right? They don't do it unless their overlords are actually, got it baked in. So anything that you're seeing here is all pre-planned, if you understand how true hierarchy domination works. And these guys are just crisis actors delivering that. So this idea that, it's about free speech, etc., how is that really, really going to be true, right? Is it really plausible, or is it more plausible that it's part of a greater plan to destabilize people's sovereignty even further? Which one is more likely to be true? That's the question, right? Because slave masters only go against each other when they're ordered to, not as a thing they do spontaneously, organically. So just thought I'd throw that in just to finish off that point. Okay, now we're going to take a look at this video, which was gifted to me, my guess is, by Facebook algorithms. So they actually sometimes work in ways that are helpful. Go figure. About another, I guess, perspective, and this one's more coming from, if you've been following the Justinian deception guys, their obsession with the birth certificate. This comes from that angle, yet the same principles are in play and they're being overlooked. So I'll play it and then I'll break it down to show you the consistency. And if we relate it back to, what I've got here with Bill Cooper and what he's saying, hopefully that'll give you some more clarity.
Well, things just got a little bit spicy. Trump's increased his tariffs on particular islands around Australia, and he's increased them exorbitantly. Now the government are playing dumb, and so is the media, like they don't know what it means. But let me just break it down for you a little bit for the people paying attention at home. Now, the definition of Australia can be found in only one location in any government document, and that is the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997. And in that document, if you find the definition of Australia, it will lead you to a list of islands. And in that list, it'll say including these islands. Now, if we consider the fact that in legal definition, inclusio exclusio means that when you include something, you exclude everything else, you'll understand that Australia's actually definition of a nautical space about 100 metres off the land for a couple of k's out around Australia and those islands. So everything that comes from Australia will be taxed at that higher tax rate because of these tariffs. That's what's going to happen here. Watch this space. Trump's going after the corporation that is Australia, also known as the Commonwealth, all caps, of Australia. These frauds in our government, these frauds throughout the world are going to come unstuck because people have woken up to the fact that they're fucking lying about things like what the definition of Australia is. Therefore, you're pirated back to this land as a fucking dead entity and they're using your slave name on this land. And see, that's why you have the islands on the road and the dry dock in a court, because everything is floating on a sea of deceptive fiction, including that dead name. You don't have to prescribe to the dead name. See, you were made prior to the dead name. You were from the creator, and that became what was considered time immemorial, which means that's before time. Once you start to understand these things, you can play a game with these people, like I do. I don't pay taxes or consent with any of their actions. Start to stand tall, Australia. You have the fucking power. Take it back. These Trump tariffs are wild. Just watch out. It's all coming undone.
Okay, so there's so many things to unpack here. I'm not even sure if I'm going to get to cover them. Also sensitive about how much time it's going to take. So I'll just peel off what I can and see how we go. Firstly, I guess I want to get into the last thing he says, and that's you can play a game with these people. So instead of actually standing up for truth, right, his choice is to play a game like cat and mouse and dodging and things like that. So already there is a problem, right? Because unless you show a model for what it means to stand and speak the truth, regardless of what other people are going to do, you actually become part of the problem, right? So there's a big problem right there. And so sadly, unfortunately, by believing you can extricate yourself from a system that's designed to imprison everybody, just because you can avoid certain things that other people are forced to endure, doesn't actually mean you're free, right? That's an outright lie. That's not possible, because true freedom can only exist when all are free. So gloating and boasting about how good you are, right, that actually just compounds the slavery problem. So I just wanted to raise that first. The next thing I wanted to get into is the factual incorrectness, right? So he makes a comment about these islands that are in that act being, first he says 100 meters, and then he says a couple of kilometers out, which if that was the case, you'd be able to see them from the land. Now, can you actually see these islands he's speaking about from the land? Think about it. Norfolk Island, which is one of those islands he's referring to, is actually 870 miles east of Brisbane, right? So there's a massive discrepancy with what he says and the actual factual correctness of the distance in the island. But those things, if you're going to be someone who's speaking, out of facts, and you're starting with things that are just, assumptions, well, it's not really a way to build on anything that's reliable, right? So already that's another issue. And so the islands that he would be referring to are the Coral Sea Islands, Ashmore, and I think it's Cartier Islands, Christmas Island, Cocos Islands, Heard, and McDonald Islands. Now, just a quick bit of research brought that up. When I typed in that act and what islands are referred to, that's what came up. So that's what I'm guessing he's referring to. And that, like I said, if you follow the Justinian Deception guys, they talk about that, how the whole system is structured to exclude the actual mainland, what we know as Australia, which other people refer to as Terra Australis, because that was inhabited by a population prior, so they can't run that false system on a land that's already preoccupied. So they find islands that were not. Apparently, I can't prove that, but that's what I'm hearing through the Justinian Deception guys. And they use that as their base, this whole criminal structure, to administer this elusive system they invented so they can avoid karmic debt for what they're actually doing. right? Because it's all fake, it's not real, etc. It's so convoluted, I didn't want to get any more into it because it's just not worth putting energy into. But that's basically the premise of what the Justinian deception guys, go on about and they obsess over, which is a tragedy because it misses the point. Because if you want other people to accept the truth, why go start in the place that's the most likely for them to resist it? Why would you start there? That's you're just creating unnecessary pain for yourself, right? And you're just going to be seen as someone who's way out there because the whole system of deception runs from the idea, and it's in Larkin's movie, the Jones Plantation film, I think it's called, where they make that really clear, right? He says, if you want absolute power, you have to be willing to do what the ordinary man would never, ever conceive, because then they'll never believe it. And anyone who tries to tell them, they'll just write them off as a lunatic, right? So yes, there's absolutely legs in what is being uncovered here by the Justinian deception. Yet if you fixate on that and lead there, what are the likelihood you're going to get other people to come along with you, right? It's very unlikely because you don't understand that principle. And so these guys are slamming their heads into the wall without understanding why. And so that's the other part that I wanted to cover. Now, the whole principle of slavery, which I just covered a moment ago, runs from coercion, right? So this guy is more than happy for his perceived slave master, which he sees as his savior, which most people who've taken on that well-constructed psyop about the white hats, what are they, the Q decoders, there's so many different terms, I can't even keep up with it. And there's all these groups that are created around that, right? And they fully buy into it as its truth, right? So if you take that perspective, then your version of reality is going to bend to suit that belief, right? So this guy, you can see, he's fully invested in this belief that, Trump is the savior sent from some other dimension to save humanity, and he's got to do it from the inside, right? He can't do it any other way, right? Now, in the next video, I'm going to show you the actual psychopathy of billionaires. And if you've been following what's been happening with the appointments that have been made in this administration, it's basically a bunch of billionaires, right? I'll get to that in a second of why I've even brought that up. So again, it comes down to the use of coercion because it's going to suit what I want. So if you're going to compromise that principle, there cannot be any freedom. That's the whole, which I said a moment ago, the means justifies the end. Well, if you go down that path, you are going to make sure there's going to be more violence and more slavery, right? This individual can't recognize that because of their attachment to the belief, right? Now, I was privy to being shown a conversation between two people where one was questioning the other, and the other being someone who started a group that is a full believer in this whole Trump mythology, that he's like a savior, and it's all this covert, people that are working with him in the military, etc., that are bringing down the deep state, right? And the line of questioning that was posed to this individual who started this group and is the administrator got to a point where the administrator actually had no other choice but to actually expose what sits behind why they're so adherent to this belief. And that was the statement when they came out and said, well, if the stuff about Trump is all bullshit, then we're all FUCKED'd, right? That says everything. And that's the unrecognized part, that anyone who's been sucked into this, who can see the criminality of the structure, but yet is being cordoned into this psyop, that's the unrecognized part that they're unwilling to say out loud. And because they don't say it out loud, and even the ones who do, they don't actually look into, well, hang on a second, isn't this me collapsing my morals and my principles in order to feel the comfort of this belief? Like, how is that consistent with truth? Because you cannot come to truth unless you have the capacity to consistently apply principles in every single circumstance. As soon as you compromise that, you are no longer in truth, you are down the hole of bias. And so that's a perfect example, right? And there's something about that doesn't get looked at enough. So that's why I'm bringing it up is, when can you recognize that you will compromise principle in order to maintain your attachment, right? And the emotions that are connected to that attachment that you want to preserve. And that's essentially how we all get controlled. So the people who understand human psychology know that back to front, and they use that against us. And here's a perfect example of how it's being used, right? So because, he's going, wow, look at these places that he's taxing. Like they're not even, there's bugger all people in there. Well, that means that, now my narrative is going to be, aha, this is fitting the whole thing that I've fallen for. And this is the next part of that, right? And so you can drag people out for eternity, because if you just set up that idea that this is all covert and, you've got to trust the plan, etc., and you set that up, well, then they're not going to question using their moral faculties and their conscience. They're going to suppress that, right? And this guy's doing it. It's the perfect example. And so, what he's actually doing is advocating for evil. Now, there's a meme. I don't know if it's a meme, but it's a graphic that I'm putting up now. That's a quote from Hannah Arendt, which is perfect for this right now. So I'm going to read it. In their moral justification, the argument of the lesser evil has played a prominent role. If you are confronted with two evils, the argument runs, it is your duty to opt for the lesser one, whereas it is irresponsible to refuse to choose altogether. Its weakness has always been that those who choose the lesser evil forget quickly they choose evil. So when I heard him say what he said, this quote immediately shot to mind. And that is that, like that woman that I said, in that exchange, if we don't accept this, then there's nothing else but oblivion. So we better accept this. So they're willing to forego all the things they know is immoral about the behavior, because the alternative is oblivion. Like, that's a beautiful setup to get people to actually contribute to their own enslavement without knowing they're doing it. And so that's why I wanted to bring that this into the video as well. It's really, really important to understand that people are controlled through their unwillingness to face the discomforts of what they've accepted and have chosen to accept in order to survive a slavery system, right? And anyone who shows that inconsistency and that contradiction is their mortal enemy. So that's why people like me, I don't get very many views, because it's uncomfortable, right? And the majority of people are not in that part of evolution that they are wanting to face up to the real things they conceal about themselves. They're not there. There's no massive awakening in that space. And so that's the tragedy of what sits under all this. Now, I want to get into what I said before, which I was alluding to capitalism and how the whole administration, that PMERT, which is just Trump backwards, but I like PMERT. That's quite amusing. If you type that in, you'll see what that means. So I highly recommend you do that just into AI and see what it gives you. That administration that he's running, well, he's just a middle manager, by the way, and his billionaires as well. They run from this ideology of capitalism, right? And if you understand that, and you need to do a little bit of work to get to this level of understanding, because this isn't something that you can get straight away, especially if you've got attachment. And Larkin Rose, sadly, he's got an attachment to capitalism that's actually contradictory to all the other principles, right? And that is that capitalism actually has within it the capacity for voluntary exchange. The whole idea of exchange is not voluntary. It's a duty, because it's an obligation. If you give something only because you're motivated to get something, you are setting up an obligation, and that's slavery. And that's a really, really critical principle to understand. So if that's got your attention, wait until you hear this one. The whole idea that barter was how people used to exchange before capitalism is an actual myth. That was invented by economists, which would be Satanists, to get people ready for capitalism as the next natural progression. But it didn't actually exist before. Like, if you don't believe me, you can go and read people whose job it's been to actually document history. They're called anthropologists. I'll even give you a name, David Graeber. He's written several books to do with debt and society previous to capitalism, and there's no documented evidence anywhere that there was any kind of barter before. The system they used to run was closer to the Inuit system, where people would just give willingly, what's called social ecology. That's what they do in Rojava now, where you give out of need, and people's hearts are open to receiving because they understand that that's a natural thing. We want to give to one another. And so when you have something that someone else needs, it just opens your heart to give. So it's a whole different way. It was just a way more stronger bonded community before capitalism came in. But they had to set it up by making people believe that barter was an actual thing. So this is how programming works, right? People don't know their history. They just accept what they're told without actually checking it out. I mean, who's got the time to go and check every fact that's been thrown your way? It's pretty hard, right? So it's easy to fall for it. But I just wanted to throw that one in. Okay, so now I'm just going to interject with this, I guess, these two suggestions for videos to watch. Highly recommend, if you really want to understand the psychopathy of those who came up with capitalism and the resulting atrocities and outright organized murder that comes from that ideology. Like, Richard will break this down beautifully, and he puts it in such a simple language. So he really explains how you might be politically independent, because that's just something on paper, but until you're economically independent, you are still part of that slavery system that capitalism insists upon, because it has to expand. And that whole idea of colonialism was born out of what capitalism requires, and that is expanding into new territories, because it's constantly competing and needing to grow. And so all the devastation that's happened on this planet, a high proportion of it comes from that satanic ideology. So he never says those words, that it's satanic, but once you hear how it's all piece by piece done, and the absolute unconscionable things that have done deliberately to feed this ideology, it makes it pretty hard not to be able to draw those dots. So that's just there for you if you're really interested in learning and understanding how Satanism gets concealed in things like capitalism. And then people like this guy actually believes that, a hardcore capitalist like Trump is actually doing things to liberate people, when capitalism is all about enslavement. Now, a capitalist will set up a situation where they are going to exploit labor, but make it look like you are getting a choice, right? That's how they do it. Because if you look at the history of how the world used to work before capitalism came to be, there was common lands that people would till and use to live off. Well, they all got removed. So then how are people going to be independent if they don't have anything to work from? Because the land isn't owned by anybody. Yet those with that capitalist ideology, in which you can relate that straight back to Satanism, because it comes from superior and inferior, right? They will make sure to tilt the table so there is no common lands, right? And so what do they use? They use the legislature, which they all infested. And by then there was no trial by jury to be actually prevent people from being tyrannized like that, to actually make it that people couldn't use these lands, right? So then what are the choices that they have left if they don't want to die, is to, go and become the labor force, right? And so that's what doesn't get understood. The other part is the whole capitalist psychopathy it's about maximizing profits. So countries like Australia, America, Canada, their manufacturing is like shot down quickly because of that ideology, right? Because one of the things that you're going to look for if you're a capitalist to maximize profit is cheap labor. Well, if you have government intervention where they set certain standards where there's a minimum amount that must be paid, etc., then where is it going to be favorable? In those places where those standards aren't. So what happened? A majority of manufacturing got outsourced to those countries, and one of those countries or slave plantations, should I say, is China, right? So what did the ruling class or the middle managers of China do? Well, they use that to their favor, right? Which now they've become largely independent and only dependent on raw materials, but they've set it up in a way where the countries that are exporting raw materials are dependent on them, on China, because the products they produce, especially technology, China is the hugest producer of that. So for a country to cease exporting the raw minerals or a slave plantation to China is to cease having access to that very technology that the entire global system is dependent upon. So that's the clever part of what China's done, how they've organized it so the dependency on them is beyond control of the capitalist, because the capitalist doesn't care about their allegiance. They just care about profit, right? Which is all the whole satanic thing. Now you need to understand that, and to understand what this tariff is, that there is no actual trade deficit in the sense of tariffs being the reason. The trade deficit is that the USA, and we use them as an example, exports raw minerals, and there's not that much required compared to how much it imports in the tech that's made from those exports, right? So there's a massive difference in how much they export compared to what they import from what gets made from those materials. That's got nothing to do with tariff. That's just the capitalist structure that's gone and put all their resources into those slave plantations that don't have the same labor restrictions, right, that they do in these slave plantations. And so you have to understand that to understand what this is really about. So, hopefully that's giving you some context of how people are easily fooled because they don't have the knowledge. They haven't gone and done the research into what economics really is and how it really operates. And that all that P-Mert's really doing is trying to present a front that he can't stop. He can't stop what's actually in train because of all the capitalists he is surrounded by, which he is one of. Their own psychopathy has led to the downfall of the slave plantation. So they need to provide these psyops to have the people remain docile so they don't understand what's really been happening all this time. So I want to just add a video, not the actual video itself, because this video is going to go far longer than I wanted to, and I've still got more to cover, but just like a screenshot of a particular video from Larkin Rose that explains tariffs, just so if you're really interested in learning, he'll break it down beautifully. So I wanted to put that in there now before I finish off. Okay, so this has gone far longer than I intended, so I'm stopping it here. If you've had value in part 1 and part 2, and you're still searching for a little bit more depth, I highly recommend you stick around for number 3. In the meantime, you can go to magnacarta1215.com. There you'll have lots of resources. For example, you've got an action tab where if you're ready to take action, there's plenty of campaigns that you can get involved in. So I highly recommend that. You've got a bunch of learning to do if you're someone who's into learning and really solidifying knowledge based on self-evident truths. You've got memes you can share out. There's social proof. There's communities that are starting to come together online so you can find out where they are. Ton of stuff. So highly recommend you go there and stick around for part 3 when it's released.